The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. Soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. Zenabou froze mid-step, her fingers tightening around the handle of the teacup she had just retrieved from the kitchen. It was late at night, far past midnight, and the house should have been silent except for the occasional hum of crickets outside. Her fiancé, Peter, was thousands of miles away on yet another business trip, leaving her alone in this sprawling mansion with nothing but shadows for company. Her heart raced as she strained her ears. Was it one of the workers? Or worse, someone else? "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound brave. A low chuckle drifted back to her, a familiar laugh that sent both relief and unease coursing through her veins. "Relax, Zena. It's just me." Ben stepped into the dim light spilling from the kitchen, his tall frame silhouetted against the doorway. His dark eyes sparkled mischievously as he leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Even in the faint glow, Zenabou could see the way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders, hinting at muscles honed by years of physical labor and sports. She exhaled sharply, clutching her chest. "You scared me half to death. What are you doing up so late?" He shrugged, his grin widening. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd grab a snack. But now that I'm here," he tilted his head, studying her intently. "Why are you still awake? Another restless night?" Zenabou hesitated, suddenly aware of how thin her nightgown was, how exposed she felt under his gaze. She shifted uncomfortably, pulling the fabric tighter around herself. I couldn't sleep either," she admitted finally. "Too many thoughts." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Thoughts about what?" She opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. How could she explain the storm brewing inside her? The guilt, the longing, the confusion. Instead, she forced a smile and turned toward the counter. "Never mind. Do you want some tea?" As she busied herself preparing the drink, she felt his presence looming closer, his warmth radiating behind her. When his hand brushed hers accidentally while reaching for sugar, a jolt shot through her body like electricity. She pulled away quickly, pretending not to notice the flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. Little did Zenabou know, this moment would mark the beginning of a chain reaction, a whirlwind of passion, betrayal, and impossible choices that would unravel everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and family. Zenabou woke up the next morning feeling conflicted about her late-night encounter with Ben. She tried to shake off the lingering tension but found herself replaying their interaction over and over again. His laugh echoed in her mind, his casual demeanor masking something deeper, something she wasn't ready to confront. As sunlight streamed through the curtains, she pulled on her robe and headed downstairs, hoping routine might distract her. The house was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of workers preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Zenabou wandered into the dining room, where a vase of fresh flowers sat atop the table, a gift from Peter during one of his rare visits. Her fingers brushed against the petals, soft yet fragile, much like her own emotions. She sighed, realizing how dependent she had become on Ben's presence in Peter's absence. Later that day, Ben joined her for lunch, his usual charm masking an undercurrent of unease. "You seem distracted," he remarked, tilting his head as he studied her. "Everything okay?" Zenabou hesitated, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." Ben nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely believe her. They continued eating in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Eventually he broke the quiet. "You know, Zena, if there's anything bothering you, you can talk to me. I'm here." His sincerity caught her off guard, and for a moment she considered opening up. But the weight of societal expectations, and her impending marriage to Peter, held her back. Instead, she changed the subject, steering the conversation toward safer topics like work and family. Yet, even as they laughed and joked, Zenabou couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him, a magnetic force that grew stronger with each passing day. By evening, guilt settled heavily in her chest. What was happening between them? Was it merely friendship or something more dangerous? As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Zenabou resolved to distance herself from Ben, to protect her heart, her future, and the promises she'd made to Peter. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The days passed in a blur of stolen glances and awkward silences, but Zenabou found herself unable to fully distance from Ben as she had resolved to do. Their interactions became a delicate dance, polite yet charged, casual yet laced with unspoken longing. Every time their paths crossed, whether over breakfast or during an impromptu discussion about household repairs, Zenabou felt her resolve weakening. One afternoon, as she sat on the veranda sipping tea, Ben approached hesitantly, holding a book in one hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. His voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. Zenabou hesitated before nodding, scooting slightly to make room for him on the wicker love seat. He settled beside her, close enough that their knees almost touched. The proximity sent a shiver down her spine, though she tried to appear unaffected. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the garden. Finally Ben spoke, breaking the quiet. "You've been avoiding me lately." His words startled her, though they shouldn't have. She fumbled for a response, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "I haven't been avoiding you," she lied, her voice faltering. "Just busy." Ben raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Busy? Or trying to convince yourself this isn't happening?" Zenabou froze, her breath catching in her throat. His bluntness left no room for denial, forcing her to confront the truth she'd been running from. "What do you mean this?" she countered weakly, though her racing heart betrayed her. He leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "You know exactly what I mean, Zena. This pull between us, it's real. And pretending otherwise isn't going to make it go away." Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned away, unable to meet his intensity. "It doesn't matter, Ben. I'm engaged to Peter. That's my life now." "But is it the life you want?" he pressed gently, his tone filled with both hope and despair. "Or is it just the life everyone expects you to live?" Zenabou didn't answer. Instead, she stood abruptly, muttering something about needing fresh air, and fled inside. Yet even as she escaped the conversation, she couldn't escape the questions swirling in her mind, or the growing realization that her feelings for Ben were far more complicated than she'd allowed herself to admit. A few weeks later, Zenabou's fragile peace was shattered when thieves broke into the house late one night. Startled awake by the sound of shattering glass, she bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding wildly. Her first instinct was to scream, but fear paralyzed her vocal cords. She grabbed her phone, trembling as she dialed Peter's number, only to remember he was thousands of miles away on another business trip. Before she could think further, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her bedroom. Panic surged through her veins as she scrambled to barricade the door with furniture. Just as she finished, the handle jiggled violently, sending her heart into overdrive. Then suddenly, a familiar voice called out, "Zena." "It's me, Ben." Relief washed over her like a tidal wave, and she rushed to open the door. Ben stood there, flashlight in hand, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks as she collapsed into his arms. "I thought I was going to die," she sobbed, clutching him tightly. Ben held her close, murmuring reassurances until her breathing steadied. Once she calmed down, he explained that he'd heard the commotion from his parents' house nearby and rushed over immediately. Together they surveyed the damage, the shattered window, the ransacked living room, but thankfully nothing irreplaceable had been taken. The next morning, Peter called upon hearing about the incident. Over video chat, he scolded Zenabou for staying in such a vulnerable position without proper protection. "This can't happen again," he declared firmly. "Ben needs to move in, at least temporarily, to deter future intrusions." Though Zenabou initially protested, citing propriety and appearances, logic eventually won out. Having Ben under the same roof would indeed provide security, but it also meant navigating their complicated dynamic daily. As Ben began settling into the guest apartment later that week, Zenabou couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement would change everything, and not necessarily for the better. With Ben officially living in the guest apartment, dinners became a nightly ritual, a tradition neither of them dared question or resist. At first, Zenabou told herself these meals were purely practical. After all, sharing food ensured efficiency and minimized waste. But deep down she knew the truth. She craved his company, his laughter, the way he made her feel seen in ways Peter never did. Each evening, they gathered around the dining table, plates piled high with hearty Kenyan dishes prepared by the housemaid. Conversation flowed easily between them, ranging from light-hearted anecdotes about childhood mischief to deeper discussions about dreams and aspirations. One night, after too much wine, Zenabou accidentally revealed how lonely she felt whenever Peter traveled. "I know he has responsibilities," she admitted softly, tracing patterns on the tablecloth with her fingertip. "But sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." Ben reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. "You deserve happiness, Zena, not obligation. Don't lose sight of that." His touch sent warmth spreading through her body, igniting emotions she'd worked so hard to suppress. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the world fading away until only they remained. Then reality crashed back in, and Zenabou pulled her hand away, clearing her throat nervously. "We should clean up," she muttered, standing abruptly. As she carried dishes to the kitchen, Zenabou realized the line between friendship and something more was growing thinner with each passing day, and resisting it was becoming harder than ever. Friday movie nights quickly became their sacred tradition, a ritual that offered both comfort and danger in equal measure. Each week, Zenabou and Ben would settle onto the plush couch in the living room, surrounded by bowls of popcorn and steaming mugs of tea. The dim glow of the television cast flickering shadows across their faces, creating an intimacy neither dared acknowledge aloud. One particular evening, they chose a romantic drama at Ben's suggestion. "It's supposed to be really good," he said casually, though his smirk hinted at mischief. Zenabou rolled her eyes but didn't protest, secretly intrigued by his choice. As the film unfolded, its themes of forbidden love and unresolved longing struck uncomfortably close to home. Zenabou found herself glancing at Ben more often than she cared to admit, wondering if he felt the same resonance. When a particularly passionate scene played out on screen, she shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushing as the characters exchanged vows of eternal devotion. "You okay?" Ben whispered, leaning closer. His breath tickled her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "Fine," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. But the tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. By the time the credits rolled, neither had moved from their spots. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally Ben broke it. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to act on your feelings instead of suppressing them?" Zenabou froze, her heart hammering wildly. "What feelings?" she asked, feigning ignorance despite knowing exactly what he meant. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Come on, Zena. Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I'm talking about." For a moment, she considered denying everything, retreating behind the walls she'd built to protect herself. But then something inside her snapped. She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, Ben. I wonder all the time. But it doesn't matter. I'm engaged to Peter. That's my reality." Ben reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet firm. "Reality can change, Zena. If you let it." The air crackled with electricity as they stared at each other, inches apart. For a fleeting second, Zenabou allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where duty didn't dictate her choices. Then reality intruded once more, and she pulled away, standing abruptly. "We should go to bed," she murmured, fleeing before either of them could say or do something irreversible. Weeks passed, and the tension between Zenabou and Ben grew unbearable. They continued their Friday movie nights, but the atmosphere had shifted, charged with anticipation and restraint. One evening, after watching another emotionally charged film, Zenabou lingered on the couch, unable to summon the energy to leave. Ben sat beside her, equally reluctant to end the night. "Zena," he began hesitantly, his voice low and trembling. "We can't keep doing this, to ourselves or to Peter." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "No. But I don't know how to stop." Before she could react, Ben leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a tentative kiss. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it ignited a fire within her that couldn't be extinguished. Zenabou responded instinctively, her hands reaching up to cup his face as the kiss deepened. Time seemed to stand still as they clung to each other, their bodies pressed together in desperation. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their hearts racing in unison. "I'm sorry," Ben whispered, guilt etched across his features. "I shouldn't have done that." Zenabou shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't apologize. I wanted it too." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they'd done settling over them like a heavy blanket. Though neither voiced it aloud, they both knew their lives, and their relationships, would never be the same again. The morning after the kiss, Zenabou woke up feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Every movement felt mechanical, every thought clouded by guilt and confusion. She avoided Ben throughout the day, retreating into herself as she wrestled with the enormity of what had happened. During lunch, he cornered her in the kitchen, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "You've been avoiding me since last night," he said softly. "Talk to me, Zena." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter tightly. "What do you want me to say, Ben? That I regret kissing you? 'Cause I don't. But that doesn't make it right." He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then why are we punishing ourselves? Why are we letting fear dictate our happiness?" "Because it's not just about us," she snapped, her emotions spilling over. "Peter trusts me. My family depends on this marriage. How can I throw all of that away for what? A moment of passion." Ben flinched at her words, stepping back as if struck. "So that's what this is to you? Just a moment?" "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's so much more than that. But it has to be enough. We can't keep doing this. It's tearing me apart." With that, she fled the room, leaving Ben standing alone, his heart breaking into pieces. The following week, Peter returned unexpectedly from his business trip, catching Zenabou and Ben off guard. His sudden arrival forced them to suppress their feelings and act as though nothing had changed. Yet, the tension between them was palpable, even in Peter's presence. Peter seemed oblivious at first, greeting Zenabou with a warm embrace and asking about her well-being. "You look tired," he remarked during dinner, concern etched across his face. "Everything okay?" Zenabou forced a smile, nodding quickly. "Just busy with household things. Nothing to worry about." Ben chimed in, his tone casual but measured. "She's been handling everything wonderfully, as usual. You're lucky to have her." Peter grinned, raising his glass in a mock toast. "No. Believe me, I know." Though his words were light-hearted, Zenabou couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at her insides. She avoided Ben's gaze throughout the meal, focusing instead on making small talk with Peter. But every time their hands accidentally brushed or their eyes met briefly, she felt a jolt of electricity that reminded her of the kiss they'd shared, and the secret they now shared. By the end of the week, Peter announced he'd be leaving again soon. "Another project came up," he explained apologetically. "But I'll try to make it back sooner this time." Zenabou nodded, masking her relief with a polite smile. As much as she loved Peter, or thought she did, his constant absences had become both a blessing and a curse. With him gone, she could breathe easier, free from the weight of pretending. But his absence also left her vulnerable to the pull she felt toward Ben. On the morning of Peter's departure, Zenabou stood by the door, watching as he loaded his suitcase into the car. He turned to her, pulling her into a tight hug. "Take care of yourself, okay? And thank Ben for looking out for you while I'm gone." Her breath hitched at his words, guilt surging through her once more. "Of course," she murmured, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Stay safe." As the car disappeared down the driveway, Zenabou exhaled sharply, leaning against the doorframe. She knew the moment Peter was truly gone, her resolve would weaken, and Ben would be waiting. That evening, unable to resist the magnetic pull any longer, Zenabou found herself knocking softly on Ben's apartment door. He answered almost immediately, surprise flickering across his face before softening into concern. "Zena, is everything okay?" She hesitated, her heart pounding wildly. "Can we talk?" He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The room was dimly lit, the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. Zenabou perched nervously on the edge of the couch, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I can't stop thinking about us," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben sat beside her, his expression tender yet conflicted. "Neither can I. But what are we supposed to do? Pretend it didn't happen? Or risk everything for something we might regret?" "I don't think I'd regret it," she confessed, tears welling up in her eyes. "Not if it means being honest, with myself, with you." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their unspoken desires hanging heavy in the air. Then, without warning, Ben leaned in, capturing her lips in a searing kiss. This time there was no hesitation, no restraint. Their passion erupted like wildfire, consuming them completely. They moved to the bed, shedding layers of guilt and fear along with their clothes. For the first time, Zenabou allowed herself to fully surrender, to let go of the life she thought she wanted and embrace the chaos of desire. As dawn broke, they lay entwined, their bodies spent but their minds racing. "What happens now?" Zenabou whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Ben pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We take it one day at a time. Together." The harsh light of morning brought clarity, and consequences. Zenabou woke up tangled in Ben's arms, her heart pounding as reality crashed over her like a tidal wave. What had she done? She had betrayed Peter, shattered the promises she'd made to him, and to herself. Slipping out of bed quietly, she dressed hurriedly, avoiding Ben's gaze as he stirred awake. "Zena," he called softly, his voice thick with sleep. "Where are you going?" "I need some air," she replied, her tone clipped. "I'll see you later." She fled the apartment, retreating to the safety of her bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. How could she face Peter now? How could she look him in the eye knowing what she'd done? Hours passed in a haze of guilt and self-loathing. When Ben knocked on her door later that afternoon, she ignored him, unwilling or unable to confront the mess they'd created. Eventually he left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Zenabou realized the truth. She couldn't undo what had happened. All she could do was decide how to move forward, and hope that somehow they could find a way to fix the broken pieces of their lives. The days following their night together were a blur of awkward encounters and stifled emotions. Zenabou avoided Ben as much as possible, retreating into herself to process the whirlwind of guilt and confusion that consumed her. Every glance at him reminded her of the passion they'd shared, and the betrayal she'd committed against Peter. One afternoon, unable to bear the silence any longer, Ben cornered her in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said firmly, his voice low but urgent. Zenabou hesitated, gripping the counter tightly. "There's nothing to say, Ben. What happened? It was a mistake." "A mistake," he repeated, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Is that really how you feel? Or are you just trying to convince yourself?" She turned away, tears welling up in her eyes. "It doesn't matter how I feel. I'm engaged to Peter. That's my reality." Ben stepped closer, his expression softening. "But is it the life you want? Or are you just living someone else's dream? His words struck a nerve, forcing her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. Deep down, she knew her feelings for Ben weren't fleeting. They were real, raw, and undeniable. But acknowledging them meant risking everything. Her family's approval, her future security, and the fragile peace she'd built with Peter. I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted softly, her voice trembling. All I know is that it's tearing me apart. Ben reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet firm. Then let me help you figure it out. Together. For a moment, Zenabou allowed herself to imagine a different path, one where duty didn't dictate her choices. But then reality intruded once more, and she pulled away, shaking her head. I can't, Ben. Not now. Maybe not ever. With that, she fled the room, leaving him standing alone, his heart breaking into pieces. 2 months later, Peter surprised Zenabou with a lavish proposal during one of his rare visits home. Kneeling before her in the garden, he held out a ring that sparkled under the moonlight. Zena, will you marry me? Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, torn between joy and despair. This was everything she had dreamed of, a man who loved her, provided for her, and promised her a stable future. Yet, the weight of her secret with Ben loomed large, casting a shadow over the moment. Yes, she whispered finally, forcing a smile as tears streamed down her cheeks. Whether they were tears of happiness or heartbreak, she couldn't tell. Peter slipped the ring onto her finger, beaming with pride. You've made me the happiest man alive. Later that night, as Zenabou lay awake staring at the ceiling, she realized the enormity of her decision. By saying yes to Peter, she was closing the door on whatever might have been with Ben. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it, not when her family's hopes rested on her shoulders. As wedding planning kicked into high gear, Zenabou threw herself into organizing every detail, from choosing the perfect gown to finalizing the guest list. The busyness helped distract her from the storm raging inside her heart, though moments of doubt still crept in unexpectedly. One evening, while browsing fabric swatches with her mother, Zenabou found herself zoning out, her mind drifting back to Ben. How was he handling everything? Had he moved on? She hadn't seen him much since the proposal, and part of her wondered if he was deliberately keeping his distance. Zena, her mother snapped, jolting her back to reality. Are you even listening? We need to decide on the color scheme for the reception. Sorry, Mama, Zenabou replied quickly, forcing a smile. I was just thinking about something else. Her mother raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she handed Zenabou another swatch. What about this shade of gold? It would look beautiful with your complexion. Zenabou nodded absently, her thoughts elsewhere. As much as she tried to focus on the wedding, her mind kept circling back to Ben, and the life she might have had with him. Zenabou's family grew increasingly excited about the upcoming wedding, viewing it as a ticket to financial stability and social elevation. Her mother reminded her constantly of the sacrifices they'd made and urged her not to disappoint them. You're marrying a good man, Zena, her mother said one afternoon, her tone both loving and stern. Don't throw that away for anything or anyone. Zenabou flinched, guilt surging through her. Did her mother suspect something? Or was it merely a coincidence that her words felt like a direct warning? That evening, as she sat alone in her room, Zenabou replayed her mother's advice in her mind. Was she making the right choice? Could she truly spend the rest of her life with Peter, knowing her heart still belonged to someone else? The doubts gnawed at her relentlessly, leaving her restless and uneasy. Yet deep down she knew there was no turning back now. The invitations had been sent, the dresses ordered, the venue booked. All that remained was to walk down the aisle, and hope that somehow she could find peace in the life she'd chosen. As the wedding date approached, Zenabou found herself increasingly consumed by guilt and confusion. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from destroying everything she held dear. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her emotions any longer, She confronted Ben in his apartment. "We need to end this," she declared firmly, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "I'm getting married, Ben." "Peter. There's no room for whatever this is." Ben stared at her, his expression a mix of hurt and frustration. "You don't mean that, Zena. You can't just turn off your feelings because it's convenient." "I have to," she shot back, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you see? This isn't just about us, it's about my family, my future. I can't throw all of that away for something that might not even last." Ben stepped closer, his voice softening. "But what if it does last? What if we could be happy together?" Zenabou shook her head, stepping back as if to physically distance herself from the temptation he represented. "It doesn't matter, Ben. Even if I wanted to be with you, which I don't, I couldn't. Not now. Not ever." Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Ben sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "If that's really how you feel, then I'll respect your decision. But know this, Zena, I'll always love you, no matter what happens." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Zenabou standing alone, her heart breaking into pieces. On the morning of her wedding, Zenabou woke up feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Every movement felt mechanical, every smile forced. As her mother helped her into her gown, a stunning ivory dress adorned with intricate beadwork, she struggled to suppress the storm of emotions raging inside her. "You look beautiful, my darling," her mother said, tears glistening in her eyes. "Peter is a lucky man." Zenabou nodded, forcing a smile despite the ache in her chest. "Thank you, Mama." Later, as she stood at the altar waiting for Peter to arrive, her gaze drifted toward the crowd. Her eyes landed on Ben, who sat quietly in the second row, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Zenabou felt the full weight of her decision crash over her like a tidal wave. When Peter finally appeared, kneeling before her to exchange vows, Zenabou fought to focus on the ceremony. Yet, her mind kept drifting back to Ben, to the life they might have had if circumstances had been different. "I do," she whispered when prompted, her voice barely audible. Whether it was a promise to Peter or a plea to herself, she couldn't tell. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Zenabou felt a strange emptiness settle over her. She had made her choice, but at what cost? The honeymoon period was bittersweet. Peter made an effort to be more present, showering Zenabou with affection and gifts in an attempt to solidify their bond. Yet, despite his efforts, Zenabou felt detached, as though she were living someone else's life. One evening, as they strolled along the beach during their honeymoon, Peter reached for her hand. "Are you happy, Zena?" he asked softly, his tone laced with concern. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, of course. Why wouldn't I be?" He studied her face intently, clearly unconvinced. "You've seemed distant lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" Zenabou's heart raced, guilt surging through her. For a fleeting moment, she considered confessing everything: the kiss, the night with Ben, the doubts that plagued her daily. But then she remembered her family, her responsibilities, and the promises she'd made. "No," she replied finally, forcing a smile. "Everything's perfect." Peter smiled back, seemingly reassured. Yet, as they continued walking, Zenabou couldn't shake the feeling that her lies were slowly suffocating her. Months passed, and Zenabou threw herself into building a life with Peter. They attended social events, traveled together, and even began discussing plans for starting a family. On the surface, everything seemed idyllic. But beneath the facade, cracks began to show. Late at night, when Peter was asleep, Zenabou would lie awake, replaying memories of Ben, the way he laughed, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. Though she tried to convince herself these thoughts were harmless, she knew deep down that they weren't. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, she stumbled upon a picture of her and Ben taken years ago. They were laughing, their faces glowing with genuine happiness. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized how much she missed him, and how impossible it was to move on completely. That evening, she confided in her best friend, Layla, over coffee. "I think I made a mistake," she admitted softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought marrying Peter would fix everything. But it hasn't. If anything, it's made things worse." Layla listened patiently, offering comfort without judgment. "Only you can decide what's best for you, Zena. But remember this. Happiness isn't worth sacrificing for anyone, not even your family." Zenabou nodded, though her heart remained heavy. She knew Layla was right, but knowing and acting were two very different things. As the months stretched into years, Zenabou continued to wrestle with her feelings for Ben and her commitment to Peter. Though she tried to bury her emotions, they resurfaced unexpectedly, in quiet moments, in dreams, in fleeting glances across crowded rooms. One evening, during a rare visit home, Zenabou found herself sitting alone on the balcony, staring at the stars. Her phone buzzed suddenly, a text from Ben. "Thinking of you." Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, torn between longing and duty. Should she respond? Or should she delete the message and pretend it never happened? As the wind rustled through the trees, Zenabou realized the choice was hers alone to make. Whatever path she chose, it would come with consequences, both beautiful and painful. What do you think Zenabou should do next? Should she stay loyal to Peter and try to rebuild their relationship? Or should she risk everything for a chance at true love with Ben? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think happens next.